How close do you think we are to a collapse of the consensus on tackling climate change? Once a year, the United Nations organises a conference in different parts of the world. They're called Cop conferences. It's about a week since the last Cop conference finished. That was in Baku in Azerbaijan. The two main concerns that came out were, number one, it's not having an effect on our carbon emissions, or at least not enough to have a survivable future. And number two, the wealthy countries, the developed world, are treating the poorer countries, the developing world, unfairly. It's leading to all sorts of stresses. People are losing confidence in it. In this video, we're going to see how these COP conferences work, maybe why they're not making progress, where we could be heading to, and we're kind of trying to decide what future they have. First of all, though, you need to become experts in the Paris Agreement of 2015, because that's when the world's governments agreed the plan for tackling climate change into the future. The Paris Agreement, in principle, is quite simple. Number one, try and keep the increase in global temperatures compared to pre-industrial levels well below 2 degrees Celsius, and if possible below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Plus, it realises the importance of finance in helping poorer countries, helping the developing world, who have been impacted the most by climate change but have contributed to it the least. And those developing countries need to be helped by the wealthy countries, by the developed world, which has by far and away caused the most pollution and caused the biggest impacts on climate change. So there's those two things, the only things you have to know. Everything comes from there. But the Paris 2015 agreement isn't really an agreement, and it didn't add anything particularly new, at least not in 2015. Really, it's a continuation of previous efforts to try and tackle climate change, going back to 1992 under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And it's not an agreement as you might think of it in a common sense way. For example, when you're doing some internet shopping, you click the order button, you agree for your credit card company to send the internet retailer your money, and in return the internet retailer will send you the goods that you've ordered. So that's an agreement, isn't it? You both commit to something and you both get a benefit from it. Or if you agree maybe to meet some friends and go out to dinner, you agree to be in the same restaurant at the same time on the same day, and then you will get a benefit. If you just go to random restaurants, well, you aren't really having dinner with your friends, are you? So that's an agreement. The Paris Agreement isn't like that, though. Say you want to reduce your carbon emissions by a very small amount. Well, you don't have to agree that with anyone. No one gives you permission. You don't get anything in return for that. No one's going to say, well, that's a good effort, but if you cut your emissions by a bit more, we'll give you something in return. You know, if you cut your emissions a bit more, we agree to cut our emissions further in return, and we'll all make better progress that way. We'll all benefit. There's nothing like that happens at all. You're expected to increase your commitments to reducing emissions each year, but it's all voluntary. In the actual wording itself, there are lots of words like encourage or recognise or could, those sorts of words. The actual binding words you get in contracts like shall, you know, you will do it in the future. They're used very sparingly. Most times they're used, for example, you shall produce a report or do some sort of admin. There is one place where it says the developed countries of the world shall pay finance to the developing countries of the world to help them transition. But it doesn't say then how much they have to give. It just says shall. Could be £1. Anyway, it's in that way. I think this is one of the problems we've had with the agreement. It's not a binding commitment, and people are sliding a bit on it. The Paris Agreement, it seems to me, is more like an agenda for the ongoing series of meetings. The number one reason was the United States of America would never agree to a climate agreement, which would mean it would have to cut its carbon emissions. They tried it before in Copenhagen and Kyoto. The United States Senate refused to back anything like that. Here is Sir David King's memories of what was going on at that time. The Paris Agreement was a giant step forward because we had been struggling for so long to get an international agreement that had any bite to it at all. I take you back to Copenhagen, where the agreement was based all around Kyoto. I wrote that Copenhagen could not be a success. The reason was very simple. The United States President, as much as he wanted to, and that was Obama, couldn't possibly do it because it was a top-down agreement that was trying to be reached, in which every country would be told how much they should reduce their emissions over what period of time, and the Senate and Congress had not approved it, and I think there were only ever 2 votes in favour to reach the Kyoto Agreement. We had a big failure in Copenhagen, which caused quite a big setback in the climate change process. We had to rebuild after Copenhagen. We had to bite our lips and move to an agreement in which every country was given the right to determine how much its contribution would be to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. They had to bite their lips, they didn't want to go down that way. And this meant the President of the United States could come on board. We all knew that, and it was the only reason we abandoned the top-down approach. With this bottom-up process, we arrived at 197 countries agreeing to it. And of course, some of those countries were making very few promises to manage their greenhouse gas emissions. So right from the very beginning, countries are free to choose how much they want to cut their emissions, and a lot of them weren't really making much of a commitment at all. But nevertheless, we had a global agreement. Now for something about the COP conferences. The number one thing I notice is just how slowly everything happens. To be fair to them, they've got tens of thousands of people who attend, government representatives, lobbyists, many of them for fossil fuel companies, civil society people. But listen to how long it took them just to agree the rule book for Paris 2015. The Paris Agreement was a complete document that set out the overarching goals and framework for international climate action. But setting out the details is a longer process, which the countries participating in COP22 have decided should be completed by 2018, so 3 years after they agreed it, with a review of progress in 2017. I don't really understand how it takes 3 years to come up with a rule book, especially if it's a climate emergency. Here's a video of somebody speaking at the Adaptation Forum board meeting. Adaptation is where countries get ready for climate change and prepare for the impacts. As you said before, the Paris Agreement is really just a continuation of previous agreements and previous work that had been done on climate change, and here they're talking about incorporating some reports that had been previously made into the Paris Agreement.
That we've spent some time discussing the importance of the documents to transition to exclusively serve the Paris Agreement, both last night and this morning. I do want to say that I am quite frustrated so far with the progress that we've made, or rather the lack of progress that we've made. I've made it quite clear, not only since the beginning of this meeting, since the beginning of this year, for the last 3 years, that this is essential that we conclude these documents at this meeting, and we have made painstakingly slow gains in doing that. And I would just like to express my extraordinary disappointment that we have not made more progress on something which we can and should be handling pragmatically, because it is fundamental to the success of the Adaptation Fund and serving the Paris Agreement. And I'm frankly quite shocked and upset that it has taken us this much work to adjust these documents as we knew we needed to do.
The other thing I can't help noticing is how arbitrary things are. Under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, they could either have votes by a 2/3 majority, which sounds like a good way of getting awkward countries who don't want to cut their carbon emissions, like Saudi Arabia, a good way of stopping them from blocking things. Or, so they can either have a 2/3 majority, or they can have decisions by consensus. They're meant to decide at the beginning of each COP which way they're going to do it. They've given up trying to have votes with a 2/3 majority for whatever reason, possibly because the big countries who don't want to change prefer it that way. For whatever reason, they always just choose consensus. They've given up discussing it. They just say, we'll just follow rule number, and then whatever rule is says we'll have consensus. But there's no legal definition that says what consensus is. So what happens in practice is the president of that COP, who's a representative of the host country, so it's been in Azerbaijan, so it's an Azerbaijani person who decides. Remember, the COP president that's just finished now in Azerbaijan, the COP president said oil is a gift from God for Azerbaijan, and they don't anticipate ever stopping extracting oil. So that person has had the sort of the casting vote. They get, if there's any doubt which whatever you should do, that person gets to decide what should happen. So, for example, when the COP was in Britain, in Glasgow, they made some progress. They said, I think they're going to phase down coal, which was a great step forward. Now it's in Azerbaijan. It's gone backwards. That they're sort of stepping away a bit from saying we should reduce the use of fossil fuels. This is how far we've gotten. It's nearly 10 years since the Paris Agreement, and still it's quite a sensitive topic, saying we should reduce fossil fuel use. And big countries like Russia, what was the other country that said it? Russia and Saudi Arabia say reducing fossil fuel extraction is a red line after 10 years. So that's another problem. To see just how slowly the COP conferences work, here's an example going back to Paris 2015 of the progress in agreeing the $100 billion funding paid by the developed wealthy countries to the poorer developing countries to help them with mitigation, to help them transition to a zero carbon economy, and to help them with adaptation, to help them withstand the impacts of climate change. That idea that the wealthy countries should pay $100 billion every year to the developing world goes back to 2009 and the Copenhagen Agreement. This is what happened every year from 2015 to 2023. So in 2016, countries were urged to continue scaling up their financial contributions towards the pre-agreed $100 billion a year by 2020. 2017, the first concern was developed countries had not yet delivered the promised $100 billion a year in climate finance by 2020 agreed in the 2009 Copenhagen Agreement. 2018, the decision text also strongly urges developed countries to increase their financial support in line with the promise to jointly mobilise $100 billion per year in climate finance to poorer countries by 2020. 2019, there was also some discussion about the creation of a new climate finance goal now that the deadline for $100 billion a year by 2020, agreed at the Copenhagen Cop, is almost up. Well, it's nearly up, but they haven't started it yet. 2021, the 2-week meeting was seen as a critical moment for commitments and action after richer nations had failed to raise the $100 billion annual climate funding they had promised to vulnerable countries, and the gap to staying below 1.5 degrees Celsius loomed large. 1.5 degrees Celsius, how likely is that? 2022, at the top of many people's minds was the missed $100 billion target. The EU, the US, Japan and other wealthy nations pledged over a decade ago to raise this sum annually by 2020 to fund climate projects in the developing world. Having failed to do so, they now face the task of raising their contributions and rebuilding trust in the process. 2023, these parties were tasked with providing at least $100 billion of climate finance annually to developing countries by 2020 and until 2025. A recent report from the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, concluded that, despite the lack of publicly available data, the goal was likely to have already been met as of 2022. This was repeatedly cited as positive news by developed countries at COP28. They wanted it reflected in the outcomes within the long-term climate finance agenda item, which concerns the delivery of a $100 billion goal. And how did the wealthy developed world manage to pay $100 billion a year to the developing world? They just relabelled existing aid. How long did it take? Did they make any progress? Very small progress, if anything at all. Plus, it goes without saying that $100 billion in 2023 is not nearly as much as it was worth in 2009 when it was first accepted. And remember, because it's not an agreement, there's no sort of equal divvying up the money that's paid as part of the $100 billion payment. Because if there was, we'd say the wealthier a developed country is, the more it would just pay more in proportion, wouldn't it? That's not what happens. Germany, France and Japan, they're the largest contributors. They donate to climate projects under the Paris Agreement 0.25% of their gross national income. By comparison, the United States only contributes 0.03%, only slightly more than 1/10 proportional to its wealth, only 1/10 of what Germany and France and Japan pay. Which is curious because in the latest round of negotiations at in Baku in 2024, the United States negotiators made it quite clear they weren't going to sign up to anything legally binding. They pay such a small amount, I wonder why they bother. What's curious though is that the people who are needing to pay the money are the people who are in a position to decide how much that money should be. I would have thought the United Nations would commission a report, and the report would come back and say we need to pay the developing world $6 trillion a year, and then that's how much they need to pay, and then the developed world would need to sort itself out and pay it, or it might not pay it at all. But at least then there'd be an understanding of how much was needed and how far away we were from getting to our targets. As soon as you go down this route of negotiating it straight away, it gets a bit blurred. $6 trillion was one estimate of how much was needed. Then at the beginning of the negotiations, $1.3 trillion was suggested. Now it's $300 billion. Well, it was, as we'll see later on, it wasn't really agreed. It was just pushed through against the wishes of the developing world. You might say $100 billion or $300 billion a year, as it is now, is a lot of money. It is a lot of money. But the world does have those sorts of sums, and it could be found if they wanted to find it. So, for example, each year the world pays $7 trillion, or 7.1% of the gross domestic product for the whole world. It pays $7 trillion in subsidies for fossil fuels. There was $9 trillion spent fighting COVID. If everyone realised how serious climate change was, they could find the money if they really wanted to. If we had a proper agreement that people were committed to fulfilling. Looking at the COPs over the years, they have certain things in common. So, for example, the nationally determined contributions, how much countries are paying, has never been enough right from the very beginning. But in the beginning it was seen as we've made this great success, we've agreed the Paris Agreement, the commitments to cut emissions aren't enough yet, but don't worry, in the years to come countries will ramp up as technology improves. That's not what's happened at all. As the years go by, no one, or the commitments to cut emissions aren't going up quickly enough, and you can just tell the way the reports are written, the news items are written, they become more and more desperate each year. The extreme weather events caused by climate change become more extreme. The oil-producing countries still refuse to discuss phasing out fossil fuels. The target of keeping the increase in global temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming compared to pre-industrial times is still mentioned. It's just an easy thing to mention, but it seems to be quietly going down in profile, and the new target seems to be keeping to 2 degrees of warming and getting to net zero by 2050. So that you can just tell the way the emphasis changes. At one time, some of the countries in the developing world were complaining about being told or being asked to reduce the amount of coal they were burning. Some of those same countries now are complaining that they're not getting enough money to transition, so they've sort of realised how serious things are. They're no longer concerned about stopping burning coal. They're much more concerned to get into a zero carbon economy, so they have a good chance of surviving. Here's one of the biggest controversies of the last COP that sort of sums up what might cause the Paris Agreement to die and the COP conferences to fail. We should have agreements by consensus. Maybe we better have a 2/3 majority, but they've decided to go with the consensus mode. If Russia or the United States or Saudi Arabia have a red line, that seems to be accepted. There was this negotiation for $300 billion a year paid to the developing world. India wasn't happy with that, and it had agreed that before the conference came to an end, before they strike the gavel for the last time, there's some symbolic aspect to that I don't really understand, but anyway, the Indian government had agreed before the conference came to an end they would be able to speak about how unhappy they were about this $300 billion agreement, how small it was. This is what happened instead though. Soon after, Babayev, that's the president of the COP, this Azerbaijani person, gavelled the adoption of the finance decision without once lifting his head up to see if there were any requests to take the floor from any party. Suddenly, and to the complete shock of many, the hall descended into applause, mainly from some parties, and the presidency and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change's Secretariat team on the podium stood up to hug and congratulate each other. A few members of the Indian delegation went up to the podium at that moment and could be seen speaking to the presidency's team. This was followed by several countries taking the floor to share their objections and concerns regarding the decision. According to observers, the urgency to gavel through the new collective quantitative goal That's the mitigation and adaptation money to the developing countries. The new collective quantitative goal decision stood in stark contrast to the way in which other decisions and outcomes were adopted, where the COP president paused to see if there were countries that wished to speak prior to the gavelling of the decisions. And was that just a sort of one-off unfortunate incident? India said that this has been an unfortunate incident, and it is in continuation of several such unfortunate incidents that we have seen of not following inclusivity and respecting the positions of countries. We had informed the President and we had informed the Secretariat that we wanted to make a statement prior to any decision on adoption. However, this process has been stage managed and we are extremely disappointed with this incident. Trust is the basis for all action, and this incident is indicative of a lack of trust, a lack of collaboration on an issue of tackling the climate crisis, which is a global challenge which faces all of us. It's not just India, there's a number of developing countries who are very unhappy with the way things are going. The trouble is, they haven't got any leverage. If the global north says it doesn't want to pay, what can they do? We'll see later on that something might happen. So, we haven't really said very much about nationally determined contributions of how much countries are going to cut their carbon emissions. Each year, the United Nations produces what it calls a gap report, which is the difference between where we need to be to get to 1.5 or to 2 degrees Celsius of warming, compared to where we are. If you look at this diagram, you can see the blue line shows where we're heading to at the moment with current policies. The orange line are the unconditional nationally determined contributions. So for a country like Britain, when it says how much it's going to reduce its carbon emissions, it just goes ahead and does it. Well, it might not do it, but it's not dependent on anyone else. But if you're a developing country, if you need this money from the global north to pay for your transition to a zero carbon economy, well then it's a conditional offer to cut your emissions. So when we have these discussions about we're only paying $300 billion a year to the developing world, this is the impact it has. We could have much bigger cuts in carbon emissions from the developing world if only they had the money to do it. So it's not like charity. This is, we'd all get to benefit if they could cut their emissions more. But I think the two most important things that this diagram shows are how far away we are from keeping temperature increases to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius, and look at where that red line starts that represents the conditional cuts. They start more or less straight away. They want to start now reducing their emissions. The money that's been allocated as part of this $300 billion, well, it's not even allocated, just some future amount of money that may or may not be available, depending on who wants to pay for it. It's not due to come in until 2035. Look how late that would be, how much time we would lose in making those cuts to emissions. By the way, have you noticed that at the end of every COP, they always manage to have some celebration, never mind how painfully slow progress is being made, and whether they're making any progress at all. They always seem to try and finish on a high note, so as to say, we've saved the world, COP's been successful. All the time, I wonder how much good they're doing at all. Well, now let's think about where we're heading to, what's going to happen to the Paris Agreement and the COP conferences in the future. The two problems, they're not reducing CO2 emissions quickly enough. That is a problem, but so far, because nationally determined contributions aren't discussed that much at the COP conferences, because each country just decides what it would like to do, doesn't need to negotiate it or agree it with anyone. They don't seem to happen at the COP conferences. That wouldn't be an obvious problem, although something does need to happen to increase the reductions in CO2 emissions. Watching the video back, I think this really needs a stronger statement that unless we have much stronger cuts in our CO2 emissions and we extract much less fossil fuels, we really are heading for trouble. But I can't think of what the solution is. How could you stop a country like Saudi Arabia or Russia extracting oil, selling it cheaply on the open market? Can you imagine going to war or blockades to physically stop the oil being transported? And who would do that? Which country is so determined that something like that would happen? I can't think of any process through the United Nations where you sit and have meetings, because the money is so important for some economies. Anyway, maybe that will be the subject of a future video. as far as the COP conferences go, all the stress is coming from the countries in the global south, the developing countries, feeling they're not being treated fairly enough. If you remember from a previous video about revolutions, injustice isn't just something that humans don't like, it's something that affects us at a very profound level, and it's something that disgusts us. It's the underlying cause for all revolutions. So if the developing world feels it is being treated unjustly, that could be a great cause for concern. But what could they do? They don't have a lot of power, not whether it's military or economic power or any other power. But there is one option, there is one country that has the power. It takes the, it's China. I'll cut to the chase. China takes the COP conferences very seriously. At this last one in Azerbaijan, 2024, it sent 1,000 delegates. It's paying, although it's a very poor country, still classed as a developing country, it's paid something like $25 billion for climate projects, which is about the same that Britain's paid. It says it's committed to the Paris Agreement and to the COP conferences. It's very concerned about the way the global south is being treated, and it was very concerned about how the $300 billion agreement was sort of pushed through rather than going for a consensus. But here's something that's very interesting. It's an interview by a Chinese official at the COP conference. China is determined for global cooperation, no matter if it's the United Nations Agreement or the Paris Agreement or any other thing. China wants to cooperate more with others. It doesn't really matter how other countries change. So I think they were speaking after Donald Trump had been elected president, and people were concerned about how America might affect the process. So China says it wants global cooperation, it wants to tackle climate change, and it's prepared to consider other things, whatever that is. So watch to see what China does, and watch to see how much longer the COP conferences carry on, because if they go on at the rate they are, they're not going to be going on for much longer.